Let's jump right into our data fundamentals video. In this video, we're going to talk about the definition of data, how to collect data, the ideal characteristics of data, and how we organize data, as well as tidy data. So please watch this video in its entirety. If you have messy data, which more often than not, you will have messy data, it's virtually impossible to get any sort of Tableau dashboard put together, even if you were using SPSS or Alteryx, any other software system. It would be very difficult to put the data in such a way that it would make sense unless you have the fundamentals down. So please watch this video in its entirety. Basically, the definition here, adapted from Jeff Leake of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, is that data are values of qualitative or quantitative variables belonging to a set of items. Notice here that Jeff uses the plural form of data. There are times when data can be used either singular or plural, but it's data regardless. So data are, or you could say data is. It just depends on how much data you have. The set of items is often referred to as the population or a set of objects you're interested in. So if we go back to Numbers 13, where we're looking at Moses sending the 12 spies to Canaan, he was specifically interested in the land, the soil. Is the soil healthy or not? He was looking at the fruit. Do they have fruit? What kind of fruit do they have? The people, are they strong or weak? What do they look like? What do they do? He was also interested in if the cities have walls. So each of those items are data. When we think about a research project, each of those items would be your data. You could almost imagine reporting on that to say, yes, the soil content is XYZ if you were to analyze the soil. Or you could say they do have trees, they have these types of trees. So they're analyzing those certain items in the data or with as data, let's say. The variable is the measurement or characteristic of an item. So if we go back to the set of items, let's say we have soil, people, trees, and fruit. Well, the variable would be the measurement. So are the people strong or weak? Are there trees? Yes or no? Is the soil rich, or are there nutrients? Yes or no? You could say things like that. So you're looking at the variable, basically the, what are those measurements? What are those characteristics of those items? When we look at whether it's qualitative or qualitative is typically what people refer to as open-ended. It's more alphabetical. If we're thinking of, how people would respond, they're going to use words. They're going to use descriptive words. They call it rich and thick descriptions with qualitative. So in this case, with Moses and his 12 spies, the 12 spies are using a lot of qualitative data to say, oh, they're very strong or they're very tall. Now you can convert that to quantitative. If it was on a yes or no, we could maybe say 1 is yes and 2 is no. So are there trees? 1 is yes, 2 is no. Typically though, your quantitative data could be height, weight, blood pressure. It could be the number of people, the number of trees, the number of fruit options, those sorts of things. So you can have a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data within your sets of items, and that's okay. Just know that there's data everywhere. Okay, so then we want to think about, how do we collect data? Now, if we're doing it qualitatively, you would be using questionnaires, interviews, observations, documents. Maybe you collect a lot of documents. You can also web scrape. So if you have interest, let's say, in maybe pulling sentiment analysis from Twitter to look at how do people respond to certain situations or different posts, you could do that with web scraping. And machine requirements. There's just so many different ways that you can collect data. So qualitatively though, you're truly looking at, how do we ask the right questions? How do we observe things and analyze all of this information to have our data make sense. Quantitatively, then you're looking more at numbers, and many times that's a survey if it's a Likert type survey. So here you see in the example 1 through 5, that would be a Likert type survey, and that would be quantitative data in your data set. Raw data, the form that we receive or collect the data. So many times, you probably more often than not, you will get data that's messy. And that's our raw data. So it's good information, but we're going to have to take it and make it usable. It could be an unformatted Excel file. It could be worksheets. It could be just, in this case, you see a Census Bureau handwritten document. It could be whatever the raw data is that people hand you and say, here's my data. More often than not, when I have a class with the Doctor of Strategic Leadership program where we ask churches for their data, more often than not, when we ask them, we receive all sorts of things, and it causes us to do a lot of work to, you might hear the term, manipulate the data to make it usable. And we're not changing the data in any way. We might have to remove rows, remove columns, change some formatting around just to make it usable. In the case of the Census Bureau data here, we couldn't do anything with that unless we rekeyed it into an Excel spreadsheet. And basically you want to have one row at the top for your column names, and then have all of your data in each of those rows so that it makes sense. There needs to be logical naming conventions for those columns, and the data would have to be formatted properly. So there's lots of different data sources. In Tableau Desktop, you'll see all these different types of data sources. You could use PDF files. You could use SPSS files. Typically, and I've been using data in my work, I've been using data since the 1990s. Mostly, we use Excel files as our data source, and then we feed that into something else, some sort of admin system or software like Tableau or SPSS. We will feed the data in there, but we want to make sure we get to the original source, in this case, an Excel spreadsheet, and make sure that it's as clean as possible. So lists of, the best data. How do we get the best data? Well, if you think about it, like I said, data can come in many different forms. If we're looking at documents, maybe we're looking at, for example, employee handbooks, and we want to analyze employee handbooks from 10 different organizations. So those employee handbooks would be a source of data, but we have to standardize it in some way. Maybe you look at, will each handbook have the same headings? Do they have the same table of contents? Do some of those handbooks have different table of contents or different sections that are missing or added? You have to start thinking logically and be very curious with your data so that it can make sense. Along with this, the more data, the better typically. The smaller amount of data, it may work well for a specific project or a specific department, but if you're going to generalize this to a larger population, you do want to have lots of data. You can look at historical data, which is also called archive data or secondary data. This is data that's already been collected for you. You haven't gone out, let's say, with a survey and asked people yourself to fill out the survey. That would be primary data. But for the most part, we just want our data to be clean, well organized, well structured, and to make sense. If we can't make sense of it in that Excel spreadsheet, there's no way you can make sense of it in the Tableau dashboard. So how do we organize data? Well, again, you should start to see this as an Excel spreadsheet. Now, this is a Tableau worksheet here, but you can see there's rows across the top and there's columns that go down. With each of these, you want your row to have one title. We can't have multiple titles. You can't have 3 rows introducing this information. You need 1 row. So a lot of times we have to rename those rows so that it makes the most sense. Your columns right underneath have to be the data that falls in line with the name of that column. So in this case, let's take a look at city. We see the cities, Brooklyn, Bronx, New York. So these make sense. If we had dates in that column, it wouldn't make sense, and we'd have to do some manipulation with the spreadsheet before we add it to Tableau. When we tidy up our data, we just want to make sure that each variable is in one column. Like I said, we wouldn't want dates and cities all in the same column. Each different observation of that variable should be in a different row. And there should be one table for each kind of variable. If you have multiple tables, they should include a column in the table that can be joined. And we'll talk more about joining information here in just a moment. But for the most part, if we have one spreadsheet and you have a row at the top with your column names, and under each column name, you have the actual data for that column, you should be okay. Now, when we talk about joining data, sometimes we have so much data or it's coming from many different places that we will need to join the information. So you need to have a unique identifier. In this case, you'll see ID is actually the unique identifier. Sometimes it's a person's name, maybe a social security number, maybe a customer ID number, whatever it is, but each data set would have to have that unique ID to connect the two. So in this case, you can see the ID in the first data set and the ID in the second data set are the same. So ID number 1 is male. You can see in the second worksheet there, ID number 1, that's all male. If we showed something different there, we would have to think, okay, something's not right here. We can't match these two together. Again, look at ID number 2 is female. ID number 2 in the other spreadsheet is also female. ID number 3 is male. ID number 3 in the other spreadsheet is also male. So by matching them together and logically, just using your own critical thinking, you can see, okay, these should match. And then we could connect those two data sources. It's called linking. If there are extra rows, like I said, we'd have to remove those extra rows. We just want one row. So ideally, the spreadsheet should look like this, where you have the ID at the top, state, gender, and school. That's your top row. If we have something extra at the top, like here's California, or here's a date, that's going to cause problems for you. So you'll see how they manipulated the data here by adding a state column. So they could put California in the column instead of having it separate at the top. Now, when you're working with Excel files, a lot of Excel files have all these extra rows at the top. So what we would have to do is basically remove all these extra rows, clean it up so that you have one row with all the titles. And sometimes that means you may have to increase the number of columns so that you can have all the information that you need in one place. For example, if this is for the year 2016, and maybe we have a new spreadsheet or a new worksheet, each of these tables perhaps are different years. So here's 2016 or 2015, then table 2 is 2016, table 3 is 2017. We could put all of that in one spreadsheet by creating a new column for the year. And then in that year, you have the information. The other part here is that you'll see you have these different characteristics. So you have age, and then you have this information. You have sex and this information, and race and this information. That won't work. You have to have the title of your column up at the top, and they have to have in that column just that information. So if we just have a column for age and we have all the ages going down, that would be fine. If we just have a column for gender and we have all the genders going down, that would be fine. But the way this is set up here, that there's multiple different types of data in one column, that wouldn't work. So we'll have to get creative and change things around. You basically have the information you need. You just need to clean it up a bit. All right, so that is it for the foundation of data. If you have any questions with this, let me know. The data sets that you will be provided, most of this is already taken care of for you. However, if you're going to use your own data sets as you create your Tableau dashboards, please know you may need to do some of this cleanup at first so that you have a good foundation to work with.